But for right now, we are thrilled to have our first keynote session of this Forum 2024. We are thrilled to have Laura Meckler, who is a national education reporter for the Washington Post and author of Dreamtown, Shaker Heights and the Quest for Racial Equity. And she is joined in conversation by Kerwin Charles, Dean of the Yale School of Management, who has been just such a champion and supporter of this work at the Broad Center, but whose own research throughout his career has touched on many of similar themes to what are raised in Laura's book. So we are thrilled to have them in conversation together. They're going to talk for about an hour, and then we will open it up to questions from you all for both of them. So be thinking of the questions that you may have. But with that, please join me in giving a big round of applause to Laura and Kerwin.
Wonderful to see everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Laura, I've been looking forward to this conversation. As Hansel said, we'll be talking about this excellent book you've produced, Shaker Heights and the Quest for Racial Equity, Dreamtown. I'll have some detailed questions about particular themes and topics. But before we delve into that, I guess one initial question I would have is, what prompts you to write about Shaker Heights? Why is that a story worth telling? What motivated you?
Thank you for the question. First, I just want to say thank you all for having me here. Having a reporter in your midst, at least for a short time. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. I'm from Shaker Heights. I grew up there my entire life. I went to Shaker schools, K through 12. I grew up with a sense of pride of being from this community because specifically around issues of race. It was a place that really seemed to be doing things differently. And everyone who I knew grew up there sort of knew that it was special, especially around the question of integration. First in housing, a very progressive housing integration policy, pro-integrative policy, and then schools, a voluntary busing plan when other places were fighting court orders to do the same. And so I felt really good about it. And I didn't necessarily want to write about it, but I felt good about it. And then I was at work at the time at the Wall Street Journal, and I was looking for stories on a new beat on demographics. And I came upon the new superintendent had been hired in Shaker Heights. And I watched the State of the Schools address he gave, where he started talking about taking on the question of racial equity. He said, we've been talking about doing this in this community for a long time. It's time we did something. And it sort of took me back a little. I was like, well, what's going on here? And started looking at it more now, instead of as the eyes of a graduate or a former resident or someone who still came, to visit my family, but as a reporter. And I started, to really unpack the, deep achievement gaps in my hometown schools. Mm-hmm. And I was just so interested in that contradiction between this rich history and embrace of diversity and integration against still these really failures to serve black kids in the same way that white kids were served, the same way I was served. So I wanted to know more about that. And mm-hmm. It developed into a story ultimately for the Washington Post. And when the story finished, I felt like there was even more to say, so I developed it into the book. But I felt like it was a story that hadn't been told. Certainly, it had been told by many in theses and dissertations. There had been a documentary. No one had written a book about it. And it's a really interesting place. So mm-hmm. I thought I brought to it both my sort of personal still pride, even now that I know more, and affection, but also reporter's eye.
Excellent. Now, in this description of education in your hometown, as your title says, you're focused on the quest for racial equity. But even in the answer a second ago, you emphasize not equity, but integration. Mm-hmm. Integration is a path by which racial equity is achieved, it's sort of a precondition. Mm-hmm. One of the many things I love about the book is that you take on the integration project pretty seriously. You, for example, point out, I wish you could speak more about this, that integration has an historical root. How did this town come to be thinking about racial integration in the first place? So there's history. Then there is residential integration. Before you can have equity, the fact that schooling is so closely tied to residents, how are neighborhoods going to be racially integrated? And then there's integration within the classroom. Okay? And so I'm curious about your framing. I like it, but I would want if you have any comment about it, about history, residential, and classroom, and whether the achievement of equity can be short-circuited by the focus on integration or vice versa. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
We can break it into it. There's a lot there.
Yes, there's a lot there to unpack,
yeah.
but all really interesting to me, obviously. It's important to know that Shaker Heights is not a place that one day woke up and said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had some integration? Let's go find some black people. It wasn't like that at all. It was created as an exclusive and very much set up to exclude those who were not the, quote, right sort of people. And that's how and that's what the first many decades of the community were all about. Having the suburban dream of this perfect, beautiful, wonderful place with incredible architecture and excellent schools. Then the first black families did move into the community. They overcame the covenants that were on the deeds. They overcame an enormous amount. The things that they had to do to get in were incredible. And they got a toehold in. And so the first level of integration, some people have described integration as the period in between when the first black person moves in and the last white person moves out. And that's often what the story of America has been, arrival followed by white flight. And that's what it's looked like in the beginning in Shaker too. But then something sort of extraordinary happened, which was the people living there together, both white families and black, decided that they didn't want that, and they worked together to create a truly integrated neighborhood and to maintain it as such. So that was sort of the first level, this idea that, we don't want this to be a story of changing neighborhoods and flight and fear. We want this they began, the first thing they did was the, radical act of a barbecue, get to know each other. And so that was the first thing that had to happen. And then that ethos spread to other neighborhoods in Shaker, and eventually the city itself took on that mantle. So that was the first sort of precondition for any of this. None of this had anything to do with the schools at first. It was all just about where people lived. And of course, everyone knows that where we go to school is so closely tied to where we live. And then, of course, the schools had more and more black kids in it, and they were, managing the schools as they do. But at some point, it became a question in the mid-'60s of, these schools are not racially balanced. And now we're more than 10 years after Brown v. Board, and of course none of that applied at the time in the North. Nobody in the North thought that segregation was about them. But yet there was a school leader who said first looked at the two junior highs and realized they were out of balance and redrew boundaries, and then led the community through a voluntary effort to integrate, or at least desegregate, the elementary schools. And so, again, that was sort of the next iteration of this. And truthfully, I believe that and ultimately to redraw boundaries, it started out as a voluntary program on the part of the parents, and ultimately became a redrawing of boundaries so that every elementary school reflected the racial makeup of the district. But still, and that was the situation for years. The classrooms, though, were not racially integrated, because at the same time as there was all this work being done on the housing level and all this work being done to balance the population of the schools, there was also a pretty aggressive level system or tracking system where kids were in different classes depending on ability or perceived ability, starting in most recent years in 5th grade, when kids were separated out into either the regular class or the enriched class. And these groupings were heavily racialized. And while it isn't an old school track where you can't get off once you're put into a group, it was de facto that, because once you were sorted, it was very difficult and very uncommon to change. And over the years, that just essentially became more and more ingrained, and efforts to try to essentially get more black kids into the upper levels just were not that successful. In fact, some of them even backfired, such as an effort to have open enrollment where they said, we're going to just make it clear, we're not gatekeeping. Anybody can be in these advanced classes. And the result was a whole lot of white parents said, well, we want our kids in the advanced classes who weren't otherwise in there. So it didn't, and then that made the problem even more stratified. So this idea of integration and equity really exists on multiple levels at the same time. And in fact, 3 years ago, the district embarked on a detracking effort that is still underway today. So they have, I actually view that decision to detrack as almost as important as the decisions in years past to redraw school boundaries or to bus kids.
Interesting. So you've made reference here to this multiple-tiered, if I may use that expression, integration. Within a school, black kids might not be in the same class as white kids because of tracking. I'm curious about another kind of cleavage, which has to do with the fact that racial integration or diversity is not the same thing as socioeconomic diversity. Mm-hmm. They're very tightly correlated, however. And so you describe in the book a shift of the makeup of the black population of Shaker Heights. You'll tell me if I'm wrong, but early on, as I read, Shaker Heights draws to the community African Americans who are relatively well positioned socioeconomically. Yeah?
Yes.
That inflow is not the same today.
Correct.
And my sense is that's changed the character of integration and equity within the school.
Yes.
Any comments you might make about that would be very helpful.
Yes, I think that initially Shaker was one of the only places in the Cleveland area that was really available to black families looking to move into the suburbs. So there was a big buildup from a growing black middle class and a lot of demand for better schools, suburban housing, and the families that arrived, those early families, were very accomplished, very accomplished folks. So what has happened over time? Over time, the white population, which was always wealthier than the black population, has stayed wealthy, gotten a little wealthier, but the black population in Shaker has grown less wealthy. And that's due to a few reasons. One is there are more options for black families. You can move any suburb you want in Cleveland now. You don't have only just a couple choices. There are some black families who have not liked the dynamic that they found in Shaker in terms of like what they've seen, for instance, with the classes that we were just talking about. And also happening at the same time as Shaker has become more available to lower income families. And that partly had to do with the foreclosure crisis. A lot of properties converted to rental properties, out-of-town landlords. People started taking Section 8 vouchers. Now these developments are either positive or negative depending on where you sit, but they are, in fact, changes. And so there is now much more, true poverty in the district. People sometimes just going around the world, as I have, telling people I'm from Shaker Heights, people sort of assume, oh, you must be rich. They think of it as like kind of, people have heard of it, think of it as a place where it's all rich people, which is it's never the case, but is certainly not the case today. So that's been a challenge. And I think in many ways it's much easier for and maybe in all ways, for essentially affluent white people to accept and embrace racial diversity, but a very different thing, a very different challenge when you're talking about economic diversity. And when you have those two, when you have economic diversity that's heavily racialized, then it just makes it an even bigger challenge.
I see. Equity.
Yeah.
If I may come to the title of the book. So equity. As I read it, I kept wondering, does Laura sometimes mean integration here? Do policymakers in Shaker Heights and elsewhere mean integration when they mean equity? What is equity?
Yeah.
Do they mean the cutting out of differences in the left tail so that there are no more racial differences in dropout propensity? Do they mean that ultimately the overall distributions by race look identical? Do they mean that, as the wonderful story you just gave, this black girl is in class, AP class, a math class, I believe, and she says she doesn't feel welcome. She feels out of place. She doesn't belong, she said. And I thought, which of these definitions of equity does Laura, or do policymakers and activists have in mind? Do they mean all of them? What did you mean when you used the term?
Yes, I think in some ways it is all of them. I mean, there's only so much will fit,
Fair
even a long subtitle. I think that it's fair to say that when this journey began in the 50s, no one was talking about racial equity. That term didn't exist. It was about, integration would have been a much more accurate term to describe what the work was underway and how people would have described it. And today, the term that's much more in vogue would be equity. They do mean different things, but they all kind of point in a similar direction. And I think that the work that's happened in Shaker and elsewhere has been on all of the above, depending on the moment, different things being emphasized differently. But I do think that today that is definitely the focus, the idea of giving every child what they need, not necessarily giving every child the same, if we're going to make a distinction between equality and equity. So I do think that is what's going on now, but I will cop to the fact that may not be the quest, if you will, may not have always been for equity per se.
Sure enough. Has there been pushback to this quest towards equity, as you define it?
Within the community?
Within the community.
Yeah.
Have there been persons who said we shouldn't be doing this we shouldn't be thinking about it? I'm curious.
Yeah, always.
There
There definitely has been pushback. My mom had told me that when I was a baby, she spoke in favor of the original busing plan. And I thought, well, that's nice. I had no idea it was controversial. But in fact, when I went back and read the letters that were sent to the school board at the time, some of them were quite hostile. So yes, that was controversial. There's always been pushback at every point. When there was this first work on housing, you had these activists in the first neighborhood that were working on this, and the powers that be in Shaker Heights were like, well, okay, that's fine for them. This really has nothing to do with us. As one writer described it, integration was more of a cocktail party conversation for people in certain parts of Shaker, which remained, entirely white. So yes, there has always been pushback in some quarters. That said, though, I do think that at some point the community itself, and I read about this, just made a collective decision that they were going to embrace diversity as part of the identity of the community. And I think it was, even if it wasn't from a place of goodness in their heart, it was from a practical notion that said, we can either be a place that's known as a place that is changing, or a place that is actively fighting the arrival of new people, or we can be a place that's a pioneer. We're an integration pioneer. We're not scared. We're embracing it. We're the best at this. And that sounds a lot better. And I think that they really embraced that. And so as they did that, the people who didn't like that tended to move away. People who were drawn to that arrived. So you do have a critical mass of people who are supportive. But yeah, there's no question. And I can tell you one thing: the detracking initiative underway right now certainly has its critics.
I was going to ask about that, so tell us a bit about that. Yeah, this detracking.
Detracking is the idea of, I'm sure you all know this, mixed ability classrooms. Shaker still has its AP and IB classes at the high school, but that sorting of kids that started in 5th grade does not start in 5th grade. Kids are together basically through up until you get to that AP level, so into early high school. And they're all supposed to be taught at the honors level, so that's the idea. So they accelerated everybody. I will note that this was done in fall 2020, which you may recall was a slightly tumultuous moment in education. Yeah. It was, I know people are probably like, what? Wait, did you mean 2020? Yes, 2020. Politically, it was a very advantageous time to do it because they just were able to rip off the Band-Aid when basically no one was paying attention. In fact, in the announcement, it was like 6 pages of COVID protocols, and here's the thing about the detracking. So I actually think that I understand that, but and there were also some logistical reasons that they had to do it then. But honestly, I think it was actually a mistake to try to do it. I think it would have been harder to gain buy-in and do it slowly, but teachers really had no time to prepare. They were teaching online, they were teaching hybrid. It was the worst of the worst, and kids were also, if you can imagine a 6th grader who didn't do very well in math to start with and then basically didn't do anything spring 2020, shows up for 7th grade, and now he's in 8th grade math. So, that's pretty hard. Now everyone's taking algebra in 8th grade, and maybe he's never really finished 6th grade math. So this was a huge burden on teachers. But they got through it, they're on the other side of that more or less-ish, and they're pressing forward. So there are people who feel like, and I think justifiably, like kids who were used to being in very intellectually stimulating environments where everybody was operating at a pretty high level, we're now in a much more mixed setting where maybe they were reading the book out loud instead of being assigned to read 30 pages at home. I think that differentiating teaching is doable, but really it takes work and time and skill, and it's hard. So I think it's getting better, and they're getting better at talking to the community about it. Just last fall, they had 3 community workshops around the subject, but it was 3 years later, but they did do it. So it's been very mixed.
I see. A very interesting writing choice you made, and this one I like, is that you paint very nuanced and complex portraits of individuals in the story. Yeah. Parents, community activists, policymakers, kids, sometimes. But I thought about that. I'm an empirical economist. I like to read, but I don't write. It's not how I write.
What's with all these people?
Yeah. It's. I thought, here's the advantage of this approach versus the more data-grounded approach. The data-grounded approach is one has the feeling sometimes of speaking truth to some broader reality. Here's what's true in the city overall, that kind of thing. It's sometimes it's more objective. One likes to believe that kind of thing. On the other hand, I have a better granular sense of the lives of the people from reading your story. Because you describe this woman's life, I get a feeling from it that one can never get from column 3, table 4. You see that? So I get that.
Although that's a good one, column 3,
column
table
3,
4.
table 4.
I like that one.
Column 3. But here's something about the choice you did make. It occurred to me that when one does the narrative style, one is directly exposed to the subject. You see? You're talking to Mrs. Johnson, Paula, Mrs. whomever. And your identity and hers become more dramatically salient in that setting. I sit at my computer terminal and I write it. Right? But now you're talking to her. You're a white woman talking to her, to this black woman. I'm curious about the role that race played, yes?
Yes.
In the crafting of this story, and in how your results are received. I hope the question is not unfair.
No, it's an important question, and one I gave a huge amount of thought to ahead of writing this book, because I am who I am, and not everybody is necessarily going to want to hear a story about race from another white person, and I was sensitive to that. So a variety of things I did as part of my process to try to do that, but I want to get at the direct point, which is the conversations, the one-on-one conversations. And well, the first thing I'll start with, of course, is training as a reporter, which I've been for more than 30 years now, is to try to talk to people who are both like me and also people who are different than me. And the way that you do that is mostly by listening to people. It's and really wanting to hear their stories. And most of the people who I've, as a reporter, encountered who, the best praise I've gotten is that, well, she really listened. And that's what our job is to try to listen and then put things into some context. But I also really gave a lot of thought to well, who am I speaking to? Because there are certain people who are a lot easier to find than others. Who's really easy to find? People I went to high school with. Those people are easy. People just like me. People who show up at school board meetings, they're easy to find. Teachers who are at the teacher's lounge when you show up at lunch, they're pretty easy to find. It's harder to find people who aren't engaged in the community as well, who don't have time. And so I really thought hard about who am I missing? What voices am I missing in this story? And go and knock on doors and asking the head of the family and community engagement center. Really want to talk to some families who are really struggling right now. Who would you recommend? Who might be interested in talking with me? And then following up on that. So I tried to really constantly think as I was reporting this, and the way the book is organized is each chapter is anchored by a different character. So thinking about who those characters were and making sure we had a diversity of perspectives, especially in those anchor characters, because they really carry the story, but also in the secondary characters too. So that was part of how I tried to do that. I also called upon my own personal network of friends, especially people of color and journalists and asked them to read the book and give me their feedback, and then took the advice that they had to give me. And then also in a more formal way, which was I personally paid for what's called a sensitivity read, which was a woman who is an editor at the Washington Post whose opinion I really respect. I asked her to read it, a black woman, asked her to read it and give me feedback and paid her to do it. And I asked the publisher to do the same. They hired somebody who I didn't know who did that same kind of thing. So those were some of the things that I tried to do. But in terms of the response, most of the response has been wonderful, to be honest, which I'm so grateful for. I had an older black man at one of my events come up at the microphone and say, "You really captured my voice," which I was just thought, well, this is the nicest thing anyone can say to me. But some people, there have been a few people also who have made it clear that they don't really want to hear this story from me. They haven't necessarily read the book, but that's how they feel. And my feeling about that is that's fine. Like there's a lot of books, you walk into any bookstore, there's a lot of books, we can't read them all. So you don't have to, and I make it clear, I talk about this directly at the final kind of wrap-up chapter that, this story's been told by a lot of people and will continue to be told by a lot of people, and that's good, that's healthy.
Yes. I don't know how we're doing time-wise. Is there a couple of people, a couple of the characters, if I may call them that, the important personages, who appeared in the book whom you'd like to describe? There's some really fascinating.
Do you want me to choose among my children?
Yeah,
They're all so beautiful and wonderful in their own way. Why don't you, the
That's-
one you want to
that's-
choose,
that's-
you want me to talk about?
Give me like a community activist.
A community activist,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Sure. Let's, I'll briefly describe two who I think are kind of a little bit in contrast. One is Reuben Harris. So he is a dad who got involved, black dad who got involved because his, I think first as a volunteer at the school, his kids' elementary school, and he noticed that the teacher was kind of talking differently to the kids based on race, and actually talked to the teacher about it. That was kind of planted in his mind. Then he went to go talk to the superintendent about it, and he said, "Great, I have a committee I'd like you to be on." Yeah. That's what happens, I think, when you talk to the superintendent, is you get volunteers.
Or to deans.
Yes, like, all right, great. So he slowly got more involved, just literally starting as a parent in his child's classroom, and ended up on actually a committee. There was a big thing called Project Achieve that was happening, and he ended up working on the Achievement Committee, where they were going through all the numbers and lots of columns and tables, and coming out with some really disturbing results, which ultimately became public and became a big source of community anger, because the school newspaper wrote about them, and people were furious at the school newspaper, which in my opinion as a journalist was misdirected anger, but that's who they were mad at, and they were obviously really mad about the situation. And he then ended up helping to create a organization, a black parent-driven organization that offered direct service to families, ran a summer program, did all sorts of, it was less about changing policy and more about helping parents navigate the system, putting up maps in the schools, you are here, helping, a phone number, this is where you can call for homework help, that kind of thing. So it was very, and he ultimately ended up running for the school board and helping to bring in the first black superintendent. So he had a real journey and is someone I have enormous respect for. There's another more recent community activist, a mom, her name's Kim Harris. I told her story because she started out as a single mom in her early 20s, her and her son, and she was just struggled. She could 3 jobs, could barely function. She said that she had no idea, she was so out of the loop, she didn't even know where the loop was. She was like, forget about like showing up at like a back to school night or a thing, like she was like just like trying to get by day to day. Later on in her life, she ended up in a more stable relationship, had 2 more kids, and experienced Shaker through the lens of the more middle class lens, where she was, and she started to understand more about the system, and she wanted to help moms like herself. And she formed an organization called Shaker African American Moms, and she, again, some more direct support for them, And she ended up getting involved with policy too, and it being a real thorn in the district side. And ultimately, at the end of the day, just very angry at the district because she really disagreed with some of their policies and sort of estranging herself from them. But also just a very interesting journey, and has helped a lot of people, individual people along the way.
I'm actually happy that you mentioned her story. It memorably struck me. As I thought about the changes that have occurred in Shaker Heights, there are these different actors. They're community activists, they're policymakers, they're parents.
Yep.
They're parents who get involved. And I wonder what your thought is about that. Like, these people have jobs, lives, responsibilities. Is it right that they had to be the ones to do this? Is it better that they did it? Do we want parents to be more involved in school policy, to these education leaders here? They might have a slightly different view about that. Yeah.
Certain probably depends on the day and on the parent.
Well, I'm curious about your take based on your report.
I think yes. I think engaged parents are a gift, and they're pushing and they're, I'm sure, annoying from the point of view of administration at times, but they're out there working and trying to make it better. Yeah. And I want to be clear. I am not a school leader. I defer to the people in this room. I am not telling anybody what to do. But if I was in those shoes, I think I would want the community engaged and want people showing up. And even if they're pushing me in ways I wouldn't want to go, I think that's better than people who don't care at all. And I think that the key is to get more parents engaged rather than worry about the people who are, it's too much. So I think that, and what I've observed is that the people who engage are generally pushing it in the right direction, collectively.
So when we invited you, we said we'd have a conversation.
Yes.
And it occurs to me, I haven't given you any chance.
Yeah, when do I get to ask you questions?
I really like the book. The book is terrific. Yeah.
I'm so glad.
It really is good. I feel bad. I haven't given you any time.
Yeah, well.
So you got 2 easy questions. Ask me 2 easy questions.
Okay.
And then I'll go back to Meckler.
Do you like it when parents engage with you? No. Do they still do that in college?
Graduate school. You'd be surprised.
Just wondering why my child got an A-, because I really think it was A work. I'm just practicing. Well, one thing that I'm interested in is again the broader question. Since you look at this through a data-driven point of view, an economic-driven point of view, education is such a driver of a fight against inequality, a driver of trying to have more equal outcomes, post-education and in our adult lives. And there's been a lot of progress, but is there more progress to be done? I mean, where are we in terms of the trajectory of education moving the lever for adult outcomes?
Okay. So that's not easy, so you cheated. So I'm going to focus on labor market outcomes. I seem to have lost them. Labor market outcomes. So things like earnings, employment. Let's focus on earnings. I'm losing.
You're there.
So I would say you correctly described education as being one of the principal drivers of racial earnings convergence. It's one of the key things that allows us to achieve some measure of equality in this society. It's not the only thing. Okay. Active discrimination in the labor market and its eradication is another thing. Yeah. The eradication of active discrimination is one thing. Where people live, if people are resident in a part of the country where jobs are fleeing, yeah, that will have an effect on racial disparities. Let's focus on education. So I did some work not too long ago that looked at one of the results my co-author and I focused on was what was the education gap, say in years of completed schooling, in say 1950. Yeah? So if you look at prime age men in 1950, blacks and whites, there was a big education gap. Strikingly, a large part of it was for the left tail of education, high school and below. And so in 1945, the median African American man in the age group I just described in 1945 would have had an eighth grade education. Okay? or less. So we have this massive gap at the bottom. What happened in the 30 years after that is the country succeeded in eradicating that difference. Today, if one takes account of high school graduation or the GED, there exists a racial gap in attainment at the left tail, yeah? But it's basically gone. Yeah? That's something to be cheered.
Definitely.
And that's a result of policy. That's a result of legal action. Brown v. Board, that's all of that. It's all great. Parents, and so on. So in its absence, the racial gaps we observe today would have been bigger, would have been even bigger. But we still observe racial gaps today. How can that be if we made these gains in closing the education gap? Well, one place where we have not closed the gap appreciably or enough is in the right tail of education, which is college attainment. And so we see ever increasing rates of college attainment among whites, although it's plateauing some. The black attainment is lagging behind that. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason that is important is that black people black Americans have closed the education gap, say for high school and below, at a time when that is becoming less and less important. You see what I mean? That the big driver of my employment outcomes, the durability of my job, promotion prospects, is whether I have completed at least 2 years college education. You see? Mm-hmm. And so we've done a tremendous job in the left tail. That's been wonderful. We should cheer. We should slap each other on the back and so on. But there's much work to be done at the other side. And, of course, closing the college racial gap requires that we not turn our gaze away from the things leading up to college, which is what these people in the room do. But I would say that education has been, closing the gap has been very effective, but much work remains to be done. Let me observe that it's not obvious that a persistent gap in college attainment should have led to ever larger racial differences. But we're caught in a kind of an historical moment where college education overall is becoming more and more important for how people are treated in the labor market. Mm-hmm. Do you see? Mm-hmm. And so in 1970, to pick a year, the difference in labor market participation probability, do you work? Mm-hmm. Yeah? Do you work among men by whether you had college or whether you never went within 10 miles of a college, was roughly 0%. Mm. That prime-age men worked, irrespective of race, mm-hmm. irrespective of age. Do you see? We observe today, however, that non-participation is driven principally by the absence of college attainment. You see? Mm-hmm. And so just at the time that blacks are not closing as much as they once did, the education gap at the right tail, mm-hmm. right tail education is becoming more and more and more important. You mm-hmm. see what I mean? So it's...
Yeah.
So that would be my answer to that.
Let me ask you one other question here. If we want to talk about the right tail, about the far, perhaps the extreme right tail of that, which is not directly related to what we've been talking about, but I think is very in the news, and I am a reporter and all. So I'm just wondering if you could
I have a feeling this will not be
talking
easy.
A little bit about, well, you'll be fine, about the affirmative action decision by the Supreme Court, and just how that's likely to impact. I mean, there's been a lot of conversation about the impact on institutions, like your own, but what about the impact on students? Like, what is the particularly students who might have benefited from affirmative action? Okay. What do you think the likely impact is going to be?
Okay, so I'm engaging in some speculation here, but it's informed speculation, I would say. So affirmative action is a phenomenon, as I'm going to use that term, race-conscious admission, let's use that other term, mm-hmm. is a phenomenon that is most dramatically applied among the most selective universities. Do you see? Mm-hmm. So race-conscious admission is very relevant at the University of Michigan, at Princeton, at Stanford, UCLA, and so on. The overwhelming bulk of college students in America go to schools where it's not, in fact, that relevant. Mm-hmm. Okay. So one view is that a huge chunk of black and white students are unaffected by that. Yeah? About the students who are at risk to be affected, meaning students who would have gone to the flagship state university or a highly selective private, my prediction is that their numbers will decline at the undergraduate level at these places.
Sure.
That is not something to be shared.
No.
I hope it's not true, but I suspect it will be true. How bad that turns out to be for these students is a complicated question. So let's say you do not get into Michigan or the Ohio State University, whatever your flagship is, Berkeley, Texas, and you go to like the next best place. Remember, you had a shot to go to that next best place before. Yeah?
Sure.
Good. There is a view, it's not necessarily my view, there is a view by some very, very good economists and others that we should be very concerned about mismatch. This is not Kerwin's view, this is a view out there in the literature. That look, how great is it to be in my Calc 1 class at whatever fancy schmancy school we're talking about, and be the third from the bottom in that class. And to know that I'm the third from the bottom in that class. Versus to go to the really good school, yeah, and be in the middle or in the upper tail of that class. Yeah. There is a view that the reallocation that is likely to emerge as a product of the recent SCOTUS ruling will have the effect of better allocating some people to places where they can thrive even more. Mm-hmm. This is an argument. That's an argument. Even if that's so, let's leave those two things aside. I think that one thing that I worry about with the decision is how it's received by, a black girl who is a sophomore, okay, who is not reading academic articles. Do you see?
Definitely.
She's got history homework, and she, what caused the Civil War is apparently unclear all of a sudden. You see? Yeah.
It's complicated.
Yeah. She's studying that, this kid, And intro calc or whatever you take in at 16 is hard. Yeah. And so one thing that's got her studying, one thing that's made her turn down her friend's invitation to a party or something, is the hope that she could go to Texas. Maybe she can still go. But she might now have a view that places like that are not welcoming to her. Mm-hmm. And that might affect way more than the student who was in fact at risk to go to Texas. Do you see? Mm-hmm. And so public policy casts a broad shadow. It affects how people feel about the society, about the degree to which they're welcome in it, the degree to, you see?
Yeah.
That worries me a lot. Way more than the reallocation point or that we fall by 6% over there and so on like that. Let me make one other thing. So what does it matter that people go to Harvard Medical School, whatever, name the fancy. What does it matter? It matters because, or Yale. It matters because...
I hear that's a good school.
I hear it's okay. Yeah. It matters because those places are gateways to influence and authority and impact in the society. You see? Mm-hmm. And so, what would Yale be? What would Yale be? If 35 years from now, there were no articulate, informed, confident presenter in the public sphere of considerations important to black people.
Yeah.
Yeah? Yale wouldn't be doing its job.
Yeah.
And so, even if it's true that this kid might have gotten an A- at what the other play, and she only has a B here, yeah? Mm-hmm. What's Yale after? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yale should be thinking about how its graduates can affect humanity going forward. So that's
right. And of course, if it was up to Yale, they still would be.
Yes.
Yeah. That's so interesting because, and in fact, related to that, the military academies, which the ruling did not affect, are very worried that a subsequent case will affect them for that same reason about leadership and and where our country is. I mean, it's interesting, this question of belonging, which is also, just to connect these two parts of the conversation, is a big theme that runs through my book, is this idea of belonging and what are the messages that we send. And it's something I'm personally very interested in as a reporter and want to do more work on. It's that idea that and it happens in so many ways, so many subtle ways. Sometimes I guess it's a 2x4, but from the Supreme Court. But sending a message to you about where you belong. But sometimes it's how the teacher looks at you when you walk through the door into an AP class, and whether they say like, "Oh, you're here," or is it like, "Are you in the right room?" And that is a powerful thing. Can I tell one story that kind of relates to that? I mean, this is, I'm going to confess, has a little bit of a self-promotion element to it, so I apologize for that in advance. But it just was very touching to me, which is one of the stories that I tell in the book was of a girl named Ananda, who I was a student at Shaker Heights High School just a few years ago. I was sat in on just randomly in one of her classes, 11th grade English class. She was in honors, and this is before the detracking. And I was just listening to the conversation, and she was just really bright, just really smart, had so many interesting things to say. I was just captivated by her. And so I followed her out. I guess I should mention she's black. Followed her out to talk to her more. And I asked her, "Did you ever consider taking AP English?" And she said, "Well, actually, I was in AP English but just for a day. I was there, and I just looked around, and I didn't see very many other racial minorities, and I thought, I don't know if I really belong here. So I went and talked to my counselor, and she said that I could drop down to honors if I wanted to, and so I decided to do that." And of course, there's nothing wrong with being in honors. Honors is great, and it's like aspirational for many kids. But I told this story in an interview that I did, and I asked this question of like, well, why didn't the counselor say to her, let's give it a few weeks and see how you're feeling. Let's go talk to the teacher and make sure you have the support you need. Let's find you a friend who's in this class, and you guys can be buddies and study together. Or, a dozen other things that could have been said. That you can always move back down, but let's give it a try. I know you can do this. And that didn't happen in that case. And the part that feels a little self-promotional is that a teacher at Shaker who I ran into not that long ago told me that she was in a conversation with a counselor this fall, and the same thing happened. The same thing came up. A girl wanted to drop out of AP. And the counselor said to the teacher, "Remember that interview we heard on that podcast? Maybe we should encourage her to stay." So, I don't know how that girl is doing. Maybe she's suffering and cursing me silently. But I like to think that that's the kind of impact it would have. But honestly, it does. I think even that story too. The reason I thought of it was this idea of belonging comes out in a lot of different ways, and I think that's like really powerful.
I like that a lot. Can I tell you a personal belonging? I didn't know I would do this, but this belonging thing, how are we doing that? We got this belonging thing affects not only students. It affects anyone. It affects deans.
Yeah.
It affects professors.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Affects reporters.
Affects reporters.
Believe it or not.
So have there been times in my life when I walk into a setting and in that space encounter people who have never previously met me, who may in fact know nothing about me, but who in the context observe that I'm a black man, which I am. I carry that with me all the time. And as based on, the vector of historical influences they've received, form beliefs about me, presumptions about me. In particular, presumptions that are unflattering. I would imagine that that's the default presumption. And then I'm aware of that presumption, you see. And I think, man, what do I have to do in this? So are they in fact thinking that? Yeah? And then how do I react? Maybe they're not thinking it. You see what I mean? Maybe they're not. And now I'm carrying around some, they're not, but if they, do you see?
Oh my
so
God.
there's like a mental load. I don't know if you call that belonging. You know?
It's certainly related. And I think that was one of the things that I realized as I was reporting this book, became much more aware of the privilege that I've had of not ever having to think about that, not having to think about when I'm sitting in AP calculus and math was never really my thing and barely understanding what's going on. There was like one day that whole year I really understood it. Other than that, I was just memorizing formulas, and and it was so hard. But I never thought that someone would be like, well, what's she doing in this class? Never crossed my mind. Of course I was in AP. Where else would I be? And it was, and the thing that also surprised me in reporting this book is, like, I knew I would hear stories like the one that you told, like the one that I heard from Ananda. Like, of course I knew there were stories like that, but I swear to you, I would say virtually every single Black parent, teacher, student who I spoke to had at least one story like that. And that includes people who had very positive experiences, who moved back to Shaker, raised their own kids there, love the community, involved with the community. They're not all, angry, bitter people, but everybody had a story. Everybody had a story about something like that happened. And it brought me back to a conversation I had very early on in the reporting of the original story for the paper, with a longtime superintendent. He was superintendent for 25 years. And I asked him, what's the key to closing the achievement gap? And he said, responded immediately, eradicate poverty and eliminate racism.
And eliminate racism, okay.
And I thought, well, isn't that a convenient response? Like, I'm like rolling my eyes in my head, hopefully not literally, and being like, if that's the answer, like, that's never going to happen, and so therefore you've got this like ready-made excuse for why the achievement gap never closed. This is ridiculous. But the more I thought about it, I started to see that question in a different way, which is that, first of all, he's kind of right. Those are the two drivers. But the third level analysis was that the schools do have some control over certainly the eliminate racism part, because some of the racism is in the schools. It's the person who looks at the student who walks in and says, I think you're in the wrong room. And they don't mean anything wrong about it, but that's damaging. And all the other stories that I heard. So I think he didn't have a full enough appreciation for the role that the schools play in not eradicating racism. And in terms of poverty, I don't know that they've had a full enough appreciation for that the schools have a role to play in mitigating the effects of it and supporting families, just like, high poverty school districts have had to do for many years, deal with all the other things that families bring through the door. Shaker also has to do that, and I don't know that he really got that. So anyway.
Last one.
Yeah.
So, Shaker Heights.
Yes.
There's a photograph in the book about that's in the 1960s or 70s. It's in Cosmopolitan. It's described as like the perfect town or something.
The good life in Shaker Heights.
The good life in Shaker Heights, yeah.
Yes.
You've got these white liberals who, not without being forced, think up a voluntary busing plan. You have a neighbor, you do, who adopts biracial kids. Yeah?
Wonderful family.
You've got, it's a weird place, Shaker Heights. Yeah? Yeah. Don't take it. Like, what lessons are there for Philly or for Shreveport or for you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Given how odd the place is in the way I just described.
Yeah.
Is anything good that's been done there replicable? Tell me about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the core, there are very few communities that are exactly like Shaker Heights, that has its exact demographics. And so, Philadelphia isn't going to become Shaker Heights just because they decide they want to. It's just not going to, that isn't going to happen. But I do think that the intentionality that the community has brought to these problems, the willingness and the interest in talking about this, like talking about race in Shaker Heights is not like a taboo subject. People are talking about it all the time. Like, they're engaging in it. They're committed to it. And, and this is a little gauzy, but when I was writing this book and thinking about what my ultimate conclusion would be, it's like, is this a success story, or is this like another story of like white privilege wins at the end of the day? And I ultimately decided it is a success story, even if there hasn't been success, because this is a place that is still engaged and still trying. And that is, I think, a spirit and an attitude that can be replicated anywhere. And the work has been done by people all up and down. Literally, students have made huge changes, have gotten important things done. Parents, administrators, teachers, all of the above, and community activists. And I think that's the takeaway. There's some lower level takeaways that I had about communication and other things like that. But I think that at its highest level, that's what's replicable.
Thanks so much. So I think we want to open it up to questions.
Okay, great.
I want to say I could not recommend the book more. It's terrific.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for talking with me.
All right, questions from the audience. Oh, you all have had so much time to think.
Someone
Here we go.
got a question.
Yes. If folks could just introduce yourself when you ask.
Yeah. Hey, I'm Lauren Dunn. I'm TBR 1517 from Denver, Colorado. And I wanted to actually build off of this last point, what was the student voice like throughout your book, throughout the conversations, throughout the history of Shaker Heights? We were talking a lot about parents, but what role did students play?
What role did, and you're talking about in the role of the community itself, not in the book.
Yeah, in the role of the work
that I'm describing, yeah. So I think that students have played an important role at various points. I'll give one example where I think that was a striking example of something that students did, which was, these were high school kids. There was a program at the high school. This is in the 80s, and it was a program to try to get people to sort of interrogate their prejudices. They had a guy who was on the stage, like kind of ranting racist, sexist, terrible things, said all these horrible things to the group. And then everyone got divided into groups to discuss it. And then they came back, and the guy reveals himself to be black. He's like a light-skinned black man, okay? And this group of students were like, this was total bullshit. They thought this whole program was ridiculous. They thought it was manipulative. They thought this isn't a real conversation about race. They thought you can't start talking about this in high school. It has to start way younger. And they actually organized themselves, and this was in the spring, and by the fall they had created this program called the Student Group on Race Relations, where they went into, at the time, 6th grade classrooms, which was still elementary school, and led 3 sessions over the course of the 6th grade year with students. High school students went into the elementary school classrooms to talk to them about prejudice, about bias, about relationships, and with the hope that would help give them a stronger foundation when they got to junior high, which is when a lot of the social stratification begins and a lot of the racial pressures start. And that program just celebrated its 40th anniversary. Like, it's still going. And it's, I think it has an effect on the younger kids who participate, but it has a profound effect on the high school kids who participate, because they really have deep conversations with each other about these issues, preparing to go into the classrooms. And so that's things, and that was I'm actually amazed. I was reading this memo they wrote over the summer to the superintendent proposing this program, which is remarkably similar to the program they do today. Main difference being, at the time they were showing a Bill Cosby film. I think that got. They were, and they started that fall. The program started that fall. I was like, wow, you guys, they're moving fast. Things seem to take a lot longer these days. But anyway, they got that made that happen. That was a student initiative. There's been a lot. I mean, even if that student newspaper article I was talking about, the high school paper does a lot of work, and they, it comes and goes with, sometimes it's stronger and sometimes than others, but they write stories about these issues and keep the conversation alive in a very specific way. I actually feel horrible for the kids who were attacked for that article, because I read it and, it wasn't like Pulitzer Prize winning piece, but there was nothing wrong with it. That was, I think, an important role too. They changed that conversation. They brought that out, uncomfortably so, but they made people talk about it. And so those are a couple examples I can think of. But there's just a lot of students grow up thinking and talking about these issues there.
Other questions for either Laura or Kerwin?
All right, there we got some hands.
So, that's very loud. Shaker Heights has a really large Jewish population. What role, if any, did religion play in all this?
Will you introduce yourself too?
Oh, my name is Ron Steiger.
Yeah, Shaker Heights does have a substantial Jewish population. I don't know that it played a specific role per se, but there were plenty of Jewish leaders who were important in this work. It's interesting. I'll say a few things about this. I'm familiar with all the Jewish content because I gave a speech at a synagogue and I pulled every little bit of it out for that talk. The initial covenants on the deeds were always said to exclude blacks, Jews, and Catholics. But in fact, that isn't actually what the covenant said. What the covenant said was that you had to get permission from the Van Swearingen Company, the developers, to sell your house. And they were the gatekeepers who decided who you could sell to. And that is essentially who they were trying to keep out. But there were a lot of Jews who were able to get into the community. It was much easier to do that. I found lots of examples. I kept coming up to them, when did your family come in? Like talking to somebody who was Jewish, 1928. It's like 1928. So there were a lot of examples that I found like that. If you had money, you were able to often to get in. And there was a working class Jewish neighborhood way before at least a decade before the first black families moved in. So there have always been Jews living in Shaker Heights, or for a long time there have been. There's one prominent Jewish leader who played a very negative role. He was the head of the Shaker Savings and Loan, and he personally did a lot to open up a whole section of Shaker to Jewish buyers, but he also seemed to be on a single-handed crusade to keep black people out, and in ways that were just truly revolting. I heard of at least 2 or 3 stories where there were a black person buying through another bank, and he actually called in that banker and the buyer into his office to scold them for this transaction, which P.S. he had nothing to do with, but he viewed it as sort of his job. I actually called his son to try to talk to him about this. His son was not interested in discussing this with me. He was I think was very hostile in that conversation. I mean, I guess I can understand, but I did try. But in a much more positive way, the first neighborhood where the first black families moved in and the white and black families came together, a lot of the white people who were involved in that were Jewish. And they really very much saw this as a continuation of the sort of justice work that had been ingrained in them. We were really not that far away from the events of the Holocaust at that point, and I think that there was a sense of shared purpose with the civil rights movement. There were obviously, it's well documented, a lot of Jewish people supported the civil rights movement even in its earliest days, and I think that same ethos came to Shaker. So you had a lot of Jewish families who were very supportive in helping to move this forward.
Go to the back of the room and then the front.
Is it on? Okay, great. Hi, my name is Deb Lee. I'm TBR 1719. Thank you so much, Laura, for coming here today. And I wanted to just draw out that I think that one of the most important things that you shared today was this notion of that there was a collective decision on what the community wanted in terms of the identity of the community. And I guess I had sort of 2 follow-up questions around that. It was just, did that always exist? Was there, and yes, it did exist or didn't. And 2, how did you, or or like, what does that actually look like on the ground? How did you know that there was that collective decision that was made?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. It's a good question. No, it definitely didn't always exist. In fact, the original, when the integration began, it was just in one neighborhood, and in fact, there was some suggestions from some of the city leaders. That neighborhood where it started, part of it is in the city of Cleveland, but the Shaker Heights School District, dating to a earlier agreement that had been made that had nothing to do with race or anything else. And there were some of the city leaders said, maybe we can just give that part back to the city of Cleveland. And, really not very subtle what their motivations were. And the school district pointed out to them that this business district called Shaker Square was in that, and that they got a lot of tax revenue from Shaker Square. So if they did that, they would lose all of that, and the taxes would have to rise everywhere else. So that was the end of that proposal. But so there definitely wasn't. There was this one neighborhood working on it, and then of course, Black families started moving into other neighborhoods. It started to move along further east throughout the community. So at some point, we're talking now in like the mid-60s, you can see through records and documents like city and news coverage, city leaders who are resisting it, who are talking about, making proposals like the one I just said, that kind of thing. And, but then you see a shift. And specifically, the city government itself takes on this housing work, which we haven't really talked about, but it was this incredible pro-integrative housing work that they did, it has its own complexities to it, moral complexities to it. But what they were doing was to stem white flight. They were creating incentives of various kinds for white people to stay and move into the neighborhood. And so it was an inherently discriminatory policy, but it was meant to counter the blockbusting that was going and the redlining that was going on the part of the banks and the realtors, who were truly horrible actors in all of this. And so the city takes that on, ultimately takes on that housing work and starts talking about this as part of the city's mission. So that's sort of how I charted how this changed. As the cities started to, and to me, and it's a little bit of supposition on my part, but I think it's grounded, this idea that you start to see the quotes from people changing, and you start to, and the way and the work of the government itself changing, that they start embracing it. And then I also just know from my own personal experience growing up there and from talking to people that by the time we get into the 70s, the attitudes are different. So. And definitely, there's no question. By the time I'm growing up in the 70s and 80s, people are full on embracing this as part of the identity and with pride, and winning national awards and things like that.
Barbara Jenkins, TBA 06. I feel so old to say that, but Bill's over there. So my question is twofold, actually, both for the wonderful author and for Dean Charles. So if indeed this nation has gone through sort of a cyclical existence around racial integration, from hostility to embracing to indifference, although the embracing part I don't know that we've quite actually accomplished, and clearly we're back to teetering on the hostility again. What will it take to get back to the notion of embracing racial equity, one? And then secondly, I just have to ask Dean Charles to say more about how you have managed that notion of belonging at your level of attainment, that you still feel that sometimes when entering a room. How have you managed that so that others can learn from that as well?
Do you want to go first? Do you want me to?
Okay, I'll go first.
Okay.
I'll go first. Thanks, Barbara. It's a hard question. I should have known you would ask me earlier. So I just revealed something there I didn't anticipate talking about. So I will say that it's handled imperfectly. There are moments when I handle it with less internal confidence and bravery than I would like upon reflection. You know, you leave me thinking, you know what I should have said, man? Kind of like that. Yeah. I should have done, kind of like that. Yeah. That's human. I try to forgive myself, try to be charitable to myself, to say, look, you handled that wrong, life is long, you have another shot, kind of like that. Don't beat yourself up too much. One must have, it helps to have, cheerleaders, you see, people who pour love and confidence into you see, who, when I'm in such a setting, I'm thinking about my grandmother, you see, who never went close to anybody's collar, but who adored me and made me feel I could do anything. So when I walk into a setting and people, of course, people are sophisticated enough to not reveal what they're thinking, you see. And as I said earlier, maybe they might not even be thinking it, although I doubt that. I have her and my uncles and my great aunts and all them in my mind. Yeah? And then there's this. There is leaving the setting, confident that I did or hopeful that I've done the very best I could do. Like the best way to sleep comfortably, having gone through this, is to know that I did my very best and it was okay. And that's hard to remember sometimes because one can become very critical of oneself, you see. In settings where I am especially good at something, each of us has a comparative advantage, economists call it. I might do something better than other people might do it. I take special delight in those moments. Let me tell you the truth about it. So I say now, there's the other thing which his name did over there better than me, and she did that thing over there. But this right here, whatever that thing is, yeah, that thing helps buoy me for negative moments. And then the final thing is, it is because of our conversation that I shared this, but it's not the thing I talk about for people I don't know. But it's nice to have a crew, you know, a posse. This is different from my grandmother. This is, you know, people I can be vulnerable with, you know, and say, yeah, I went to give this talk, and man, and I can unburden myself to them. It helps keeps me sane. I don't know if it works for other people. It's worked very well for me. So some blend of those things, with different weights given to one or the other, depending on the setting, is how I've managed it.
Can I just say how remarkable that response is when we think about you, the dean of a school at Yale University, having to go through that kind of thought process and thinking about how it must be for somebody who does not have anywhere near those credentials, you know, having to navigate the same kind of stuff. I mean, I think that's was a really powerful answer, far more powerful than my answer is going to be to my part of the question. But I just wanted to reinforce that for a moment, just because I find it very sobering, to be honest. You know, yes, there are swings, and at this moment what I see mostly happening in this country is more division. So you really see kind of where, you know, this is no great insight that we're living in two Americas where there's, I think there are parts of the country that are very focused on racial equity and are doubling down on this and working hard on it on a regular basis and to some extent on integration. Although I think equity is I think there's a lot less of a commitment to trying to move kids into diverse spaces than there once was. I'm not sure there was ever enthusiasm for that in most places, but perhaps acceptance. And then you have other parts of the country, you know, that are like actively working to ban that. So, or, you know, ban what can be taught in schools. So it's just we just have a real tale of two cities situation going on here. And I think the question was how can we get to the point where people are more embracing integration again? You know, I don't know. I mean, that's above my pay grade. But I do think that there are people who are, and I think that there are people working at it, and I think maybe one of the ways is to just reinforce that and talk about, lift up the people who are doing that. And I mean, that's one of the points of the book, is also like, you know, there might be some people who who are against racial equity, but maybe have no idea what it is, you know. And if you read this book, you may still be like, yep, that's what I thought, and I don't like it, or I didn't realize that's what it was, and I still don't like it, or maybe that's not what I thought. But at least it's like that was one of the goals, maybe, of writing the book. I don't know if I would have put it that way exactly, but to at least hold up what it looks like when there is this effort underway, and then to see, like, okay, is this something that, do we like this? Is this something that is worth the work? So, and different people will answer that question differently.
Right there, Jordan.
I wasn't sure I was going to get my question in there, so thank you so much. My name is Veronica Harris, TBR 1517. Thank you so much I have not yet read the book, super excited to do so, but I did have an opportunity to read the article. And for me, it came on the heels of the work about Oak Park, Illinois, Shaker Heights, and both cities actually remind me a lot of the town that I currently live in, which is Montclair, New Jersey.
Yes.
And I have 2 kids who go to school there. Here's my question. But all of these communities are described by the people who live in them as these beautiful bastions of diversity, and it's so progressive. And for people who actually have the language of equity and living in diverse communities, why are we struggling so much to actually do the work of equity? What did you walk away with? It's a big question, sorry.
No, it's okay. I do agree that those 3 communities are all good examples of places that are engaged. The question was why is it so hard to get people to do the work of equity?
Yeah, especially when it makes sense that we would, communities that like maybe don't have the language of equity or aren't very diverse would struggle to do it.
Right.
In these communities in particular, what is the struggle?
Well, I think it's a lot of different elements to it. I mean, but one of them, I think, clearly some of this stuff does challenge the advantages and privileges of people who have the power in the system. So, you know, detracking is a good example. There are a lot of people, high-achieving families, black and white, I should say, but a lot of them are white, the old system was working pretty well for them. You know, their kids had these amazing advanced classes, and so that's a barrier. And you have to, and one of the things I say in this book is if you want to maintain a diverse community that has all of these people in the boat together, which is different than most of the places. Most of America, you've got the poor districts and the rich districts. But if you want one that is economically as well as racially diverse, get everyone in the boat. You have to both, this is the tough part, both acknowledge those concerns and address them, but not like kowtow to them. You know, and that's like a fine line, right? That's not easy to do. It's all, you know, I understand, you know, a parent who, if your kid isn't in a challenging class anymore and they're reading the book out loud and or watching a Disney film in the 9th grade, which is a story I heard from one parent, yeah, you're going to be irritated. So you have to navigate that. Like, you have to actually be in there and deal with it. But yes, there are definitely parents who are used to getting what they want, and when they don't get it, they are irritated. So, I mean, another story, I don't usually talk about this one for whatever reason that's in the book, is about a facilities plan that's going on right now, actually in Shaker. They were, you know, going to close a school and figure out how to use some money from the state to renovate or rebuild schools. So you know that's always controversial. And one of the proposals at one point was to close one of the existing elementaries and reopen one of the ones that had been closed that's in a majority black neighborhood, which I personally thought was a really good idea for a lot of reasons. But, you know, the people who went to the school that was going to be closed were furious, and they organized, and they stopped it. In my opinion, the district leadership did not manage it well, did not sell it well, did not explain it well, put too much else on the table that was never going to fly, that angered people. For instance, they talked about replacing buildings rather than renovating them, and Shaker has a lot of affection for old buildings and architecture. That's something that just irritated people. Like, why do that? Like that, why it was like a fight you weren't going to win and wasn't worth engaging in. Or at one point they talked about just having one centralized elementary school, which would have been more equitable because then everybody's being bused. But obviously a lot of people like having neighborhood schools. That was like, so they took on things, and then so when it got to that other thing about closing this school and opening the other one, which to me at least struck me as like, yeah, this is a real equity solution. There was so much bad will. They couldn't make it happen. So some of it's when you're doing like this really hard work and having to bring people along and have them give up stuff that they have that they like, you gotta really do it well. And I know that's easy for me to say. I'm not the one trying to do this, but it's true. Like the communications have to be fantastic, and the community engagement has to be top notch, and you have to calibrate it right. So I think those are some of the barriers that get in the way. I think it's also like there's certain parts of the community that are much more likely to turn out than others, and some people have much more capacity to do that. But they should also do work to get the other people to come up and hear their voices and make them feel comfortable. I write somewhere in the book about just like PTO meetings, and whether this is another belonging thing. Do you feel who feels comfortable walking into that room, and who's welcome? So and that's something we all can do something about. If I'm at a meeting, partly because of doing this reporting, like I try to go up to someone I don't know and introduce myself. And I hope people do that for me too. And that's like, there are small things that can make a difference. But these are all barriers to making this happen. Because one of the reasons, I know I'm kind of a little all over the board here, but one of the reasons why that school swap thing didn't happen is because the people living in the community that would have benefited did not raise their voices to say, yes, we want this, and insist on it, and make it hard politically for the district to abandon that plan. In fact, it was easy to abandon it because all the noise was coming from the other side. So, that's, I don't know, I think that speaks to it. I'm sure there's more to it beyond that, but that's what comes to mind.
All right, last question.
It's always a good sign when someone's cackling right before they ask the last question.
I know, right. It's not a good setup. I'm Al Vincent Hudson. I am from TBM 2223. Affectionately referred to as the Forever cohort. So my question is for Dean Charles. So I particularly was interested when you talked about the gaps towards the right end of the spectrum and looking at the increased importance of persistence through post-secondary education, particularly college. And looking at trends that we see with career and technical education, I'm just curious what your thoughts are, especially when you're looking at disparities in income and wealth. What are your thoughts on some of the trends we're ramping up career and technical education, money spent on career and technical education, and what do you think or speculate would be the impact of closing the gap potentially?
It's a good question. I actually, a question about which I don't know too much. Let me say the question back to you to make sure I'm answering the question you posed, that there has been a move recently to emphasize non-liberal arts training, a mechanics degree, kind of like that. That's what you're getting at, yeah? And what would the further growth in those efforts due to the racial wage gap or earnings gap, as opposed to the kind of Du Boisian view, if I may use that example, of having black people in particular get trained in the liberal arts? That's a question. I think it's a really good question. And I don't know the answer to it. On the one hand, I am a big supporter of increased education of whatever form, yeah? And you might say, well, that you're in the business. So you're expressing a guild sensibility. You know what I mean? It's like, of course you like more education. That's what you people do, that kind of thing. I freely confess there's some of that. I am so I want there to be more education. I observe that there are changes happening in the broader economy, the long-term influences of which we do not know. I'll give you just one example that's not drawn from my work, but from the work of many economists and others. Let's take the phenomenon of automation and, like machine, that whole thing. Yeah? Now, there are certain jobs that are now being held by students of mine who went to very good schools and got fancy degrees, that are going to disappear because the things they do, the currently highly paid and very respected things, are algorithmable. Someone can write down a thing that says, here's how you move this thing to another thing, you carry that, yeah, kind of like that. And so there are some people who have liberal arts training who will see their jobs vanish. Maybe not journalists, but maybe. I've seen an article written by ChatGPT that was an article about me. It was unbelievable.
Was it accurate?
It was unbelievably accurate. It was like 92% accurate, something like that. Yeah?
Well, we go for higher than
Exactly.
92.
Fair enough.
Just for the record.
But remember, that's just round one. That's round one. That's round one. 3 years from now, the thing will be perfect, you see? A job that's never going to be like that is waitressing. Now, I'm not recommending that people be waitresses. Here's what I mean. Here's what happens when I go to get my thing. I say, look, I want eggs over hard. Hansel knows. We just did this today. I want my eggs over hard. Bacon's got to be crispy. If it's not crispy, I don't want it. The coffee's got to be extra, extra hot. No, you see? And then toasted, but not too. You see all the things in there? There's like a lot of back and forth. I challenge someone to write down code for that. Yeah?
Wait, are you saying that you think a journalist job's going to be automated before a waitress job's going to be automated?
I do.
Just checking. Okay.
I am saying that.
Okay. I might take issue with that.
I am saying that. I believe a paralegal job, which is a perfectly decent job, good job, is much more algorithmable than a mechanic's job, than a plumber. Yeah? And so I don't want to be misheard to be saying I want people to not pursue advanced degrees and go do plumbing. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that there are broader changes in the economy that are likely to shift the nature and makeup of work in ways we can't now properly predict, which might make the education, the kind of education we have long been emphasizing at the postgraduate level, might render it, if not irrelevant, then not as highly rewarded as has historically been the case. Given that, I'm hesitant to make strong recommendations about what we should pursue, but want to say that in some ways, the presence of these other paths should be taken seriously, should be taken very seriously by African Americans and other people in the lower, who are not at the uppermost stratum of the society socioeconomically. Does that help?
I think we're going to end it there.
Let me emphasize, please do not leave here and say, Kerwin wants people to not go to college and go be plumbers. Being a plumber is a fantastic profession. That's not what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying. Thank you.
I'm actually going to give you each one more minute for any closing thoughts coming out of this conversation. Laura?
No, I mean, I think it's been a great conversation. I really thank you so much for your careful reading of the book and for your thoughts. Thank you for inviting me. I'll make one final point. Like, a lot of this story is about people, and it's about people who, and this kind of goes to the last question I was asked a little bit, which is that it's a story of people trying to make progress, and they make progress and they make mistakes. And it's really not like a heroes and villains type situation at all, which is really the world that we live in, which is much more as what I call like it's a messy middle. Like, we're all just trying, and some people are, making varying degrees of success. But what I hope people take away from this book is that it's like very much about the intentionality and about the moving the ball forward. and as opposed to, some paragon of success. Like, this isn't like a how-to manual. This isn't like a juice cleanse that you'll like lose weight in 30 days if you follow these precepts or anything like that. But it is about real people with real names and real histories, doing hard work.
Truthfully, I have very little to add to that excellent summary. I will say this messy middle thing you just said is very much on my mind in thinking about socioeconomic phenomena more generally. That we speak about, for example, the black-white gap in education or earnings, or we speak about, we speak in this binary way. But in point of fact, the black-white gap in test scores is a very complicated thing. There are African Americans for whom, if one takes socioeconomic considerations into account, black people are not a monolith. They're not. And so there are particular kinds of black people in particular places who are especially adversely affected by policies we think of, or who stand disproportionately to benefit, from policies you might implement. This nuance there, this point about there are things not being black, white, and binary, is in your wonderful book evident in the personalities you describe. Very few people are all bad. You got one or two bad guys in here, but leave that aside. That banker guy,
Yeah.
Very few people are all bad.
Yeah.
Everybody's the good people have got a bad,
Yeah.
And there's something about the complexity of the human condition. The fact that we're all trying our best. We're moving in the right direction, moving slowly but imperfectly. We're moving in the right direction. And we should recognize that averages mask interesting things that go on beneath the surface. And that we should keep the heterogeneity beneath the surface in mind.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Beautiful. Please join me in thanking Laura and Kerwin.